Hi everyone, my name is Emilia Juda, and I'm a senior software engineer at Bloomberg. I work in application frameworks department, which provides infrastructure and tooling for other Bloomberg developers, and that includes, of course, documentation. As a software engineer, I love good documentation because it helps me quickly assess whether a software is useful to my goals, helps me get started quickly with quick start or tutorial sections. It helps me look for APIs that will help me achieve my goals, and it also allows me to contribute back to the code base if it's something I can do. And I know I'm not alone in my love of documentation. First of all, I'm speaking at a conference dedicated to just that. But if we do a little bit more research, being on internet forums or in actual research papers, we'll see plenty of quotes like these ones. People love documentation, they use it all the time, and sometimes even decide whether to use a particular piece of software based just on the quality of documentation. We also have some hard data. For example, from this 2021 State of JavaScript survey, we can clearly see that documentation ranked pretty highly on the list of things that developers look at when they decide whether to use a new framework. However, not all of documentation is good. I'm sure I'm not the only person who had issues with setup instructions that no longer work or examples that fail to run with the newest version of the software. And bad documentation can be very frustrating. Users can give up on your software altogether because of this. We can see many different issues that people have with documentation. But if we look in a bit more detail at the research, we can see that a significant proportion of them stems from poor maintenance. And that's why I think we should investigate this in more detail. But why am I talking about documentation maintenance? What inspired me to research this topic? Well, a while ago, Bloomberg Engineering decided to adopt TypeScript as first-class supported language, and transitioning tens of millions lines of code was a big infrastructure change. We had to change how we build, how we deploy, and that also included the documentation system. We had to redesign it in full to support TypeScript and to take advantage of TypeScript typings that were available natively in that language. So we took this as an opportunity to consider maintenance workflows of documentation, and that inspired me to research the problems associated with documentation maintenance in a bit more detail. So through the research, I have identified 6 main themes about documentation maintenance pain points, and we will go through them all one by one and suggest solutions. So do try them in your own organizations or projects, and in short, we will make documentation maintenance easy. The first theme that we have identified was the lack of automated workflows. Well, no one really enjoys doing repetitive tasks manually, especially anyone with experience in tech industry, because we know how much computers can do, and if we have to do something that a computer could do, that's just very frustrating for us. And this is reflected in the studies. Here we can see that about 3 in 10 developers surveyed said that lack of automation or poor automation was one of the issues they're facing with their documentation. So the solution here is clearly making the documentation process automated. You probably already have some automated processes in your organization, for instance, continuous integration checks that run on every pull request or an automated version release process. So think about adding documentation generation step to these. A lot of documentation generation tooling has a command line interface, so that makes it easy to incorporate them in an automated process. Then think about the appropriate cadence for your documentation generation step. For instance, for a busy internal repository, you could do this after every change or with other high frequency, for instance, every hour. But for something client-facing, you could do it, for instance, only when you release a new version. Here's an example from Membrane, one of Bloomberg's open source projects. We can see that in preparation for a new version release, apart from running unit tests, we also generate the documentation to ensure that it's all good to go before a version release. And this process uses the command line interface, which makes it easy to tie in with all of the other automated checks. If you want to go one step further, you could automate other documentation-related tasks, such as, for instance, code example checking or setup instruction checking, or even checking the formatting. For example, unit testing code examples can ensure that examples stay fresh and work even when the source code has been updating. I can recommend 2 excellent talks on this topic for the previous versions of Write the Docs conference. First of all, it's called Unit Test the Docs, why you should test your code examples, and it describes a markup processor for extracting code and rendering into examples. This is achieved using special annotations in the sample code, and then we can easily verify that the sample code still works by testing it against the newest version of the software. And any issues can then be addressed by changing the sample code. Since documentation examples are generated straight from the sample code, they will always stay fresh. The other talk, where docs, cloud-hosted interactive tutorials, and CI testing interact, details the use of Jupyter notebooks to test the code, provide documentation, and give tutorials. Now, Jupyter Notebook is an interactive computing environment that lets you to live edit and run any code with almost immediate results, which is very handy for tutorials, of course. And Jupyter Notebook organizes code into discrete chunks called cells. These cells can be tagged and then picked by custom scripts that handle, for instance, regression testing and documentation examples rendering. Another neat idea that I saw is testing installation instructions. I saw it proposed in one of the papers with the suggestion to use container technologies such as Docker to verify installation instructions. Docker lets you deliver software in packages called containers, and each container is based on a specific image, which tells you what software is available inside a container and how it was set up. Docker file is a text document that contains all of the commands that need to be called to assemble an image. Here we can see an example of a Docker file image from memory, although it is not specifically for checking the instruction setup. But we can see what the Docker file can do. It can run a program with a certain configuration, and that includes installing stuff. It can modify environment settings, it can copy files, and a lot more. But this sounds an awful lot like what we ask users to do in the installation instructions. So it would be cool to use something like Docker to verify our installation instructions and whether they still work. If we try to run a Docker container and the run command fails, we know that something might be wrong. I haven't heard of any such methods that are production ready though, but let me know if you have. Another somewhat tedious task that is worth automating is checking formatting. That's especially important for API documentation, where documentation generators often expect certain syntax. And there are tools available that help you check this. For example, ESLint plugin tsdoc, which helps you check TypeScript comments. And these types of plugins will alert the developer that they made a mistake either at development time or during continuous integration step. And that just helps reduce the burden on the person writing the docstrings. And similar tools are available in other languages that enforce certain standard docstring conventions, and we will come back to standards later in this talk. But this idea could be extended to other similar problems, like spell checking or enforcing other conventions, including in long-form documentation, such as guides or tutorials. The second maintenance pain point that we identified was poor reproducibility of build errors. Normally, documentation generation is quite a simple task, but there are setups which can be very complex for a variety of reasons. One study participant even said that the release manager cannot build the docs on their machine, which is really frustrating. And if errors in documentation builds might be tricky to reproduce locally, that is just very upsetting for the person maintaining them. As a software developer, I have to say I would be pretty angry if I could not run my unit tests locally, so why should documentation be any different, right? So the solution here is to make it reproducible. First of all, make sure that your contributors can run documentation locally and that they use solutions typical for the programming language that you write in. Here are some examples, for instance, from our open source project Pasta Source Maps. This project is written in TypeScript, which typically uses NPM scripts to execute common actions like building, testing, and linting. And you can see that we also included a doc command that builds the documentation. This way, the contributors can easily check their changes. Another example comes from Memory, which uses a mix of Python and C++ programming languages. And Makefile is a typical solution here for defining commands for common actions. In this case, we included a command that starts a live reloading documentation page, which is, of course, really convenient for developing your docs. Some more complex workflows might require a considerable setup cost, so for that, you should consider providing all of the necessary software in a container, using, for instance, Docker, as we discussed before. This can just neatly package everything that the user needs and automatically set up their environment without much hassle. However, it doesn't matter how nice and convenient your solution for local docs building is if your contributors and maintainers cannot find it. So make sure you document this workflow, and a good place for this is either a contribution guidelines file or a README file. Here's an example from Babel, an open source project, from the README file. You can see that we have clearly specified dependencies, Node and Yarn, and their versions. We get the steps on how to clone and bootstrap the website locally, and instructions on how to run the project after bootstrapping. The third documentation maintenance pain point that we discovered is that documentation sometimes is not a part of software delivery lifecycle. Many organizations do appreciate the role of documentation and pay attention to it, but that's not always the case, especially in smaller organizations and projects where the resources can be scarce. And documentation changes can be triggered by many different things. For instance, by a code change, or maybe you have released a new version. If you made any architecture changes, they can also trigger certain amendments to documentation, Or finally, if you had a dependency change that might affect your setup instructions. Unfortunately, it's easy to forget to make these documentation changes, especially if they happen away from all of the changes I just mentioned. For instance, if your documentation lives in a different repository than code. So the solution here is to make it visible. First of all, if possible, generate and check your docs output on every code change. Ideally, the contributor should also be able to see the preview of the documentation changes. Here again, we can see this check in memory repository. The documentation build check is required to pass before a pull request can be merged, and this is on par with other guardrails such as approving reviews or unit tests. And this check also serves as a reminder to contributors to consider if any documentation changes need to accompany code modifications. The downside to this solution is that unless the documentation build produces an error, the check can be collapsed together with other passing checks and can no longer be that useful reminder. Introducing pull request checks is also a big investment, especially if your documentation generation process is more complex. So for an easier solution, you could include a requirement to consider documentation in pull request templates or version release checklists. Here's an example from Babel, an open source project. And this is a template that automatically gets applied to every pull request. And that includes a few questions that contributors have to answer before they submit the pull request. For instance, is this a bug fix or a breaking change? And that includes a question about the documentation pull request link. And that clearly prompts the contributors to consider whether they need to change the docs. The advantage of this solution is that it's harder to miss than just having a PR check. You have to fill it in before you put in your pull request. Is it possible to completely gloss over it? Well, of course. But it's harder to ignore something that you have to fill in. Finally, I would recommend keeping documentation as close to the source code as possible, for instance, in the same repository. I do realize that this is not something that's always achievable, but it definitely should be a consideration. In memory repository, for instance, documentation sits right next to the source code. We have the source code here in the SRC directory and docs right next to it. First of all, this accentuates that documentation is the integral part of the project, but it also makes it easier to write any tooling that automates doc generation on every code change. The fourth documentation maintenance pain points I'd like to talk about is lack of traceability. To make a change, any change, usually needs some context. And when it comes to documentation, you might ask yourself questions such as, where does this documentation originate from? When was it last changed? Who changed it last? Maybe what was the reason for the change? Is there any particular history to these changes? And unfortunately, sometimes it can be hard to get answers to these questions, and we lack the context to fully understand the changes that we're supposed to make. This is reflected in the studies. We can see that more than 3 in 10 developers report this as an issue. So the solution here is to make it traceable. First of all, by providing links to documentation sources, we can go a long way in providing the context the maintainers need. Here's an example from Pastel Source Maps API documentation. We can see that these pages are generated from doc strings that are included in the source code. And we can clearly see in which source file this doc string is contained, as well as the line it comes from. When we click on the link, we are taken straight to the source code in the repository. And if we wanted to make a fix or add any new information, we know exactly where to do this. Many documentation generators will have this as a setting, so check yours because it's just a free way to improve the traceability of your documentation. For some other generators, there might be plugins available to do this. But traceability shouldn't be a thing only for API documentation. Here's an example of a React guide that also features a link to the page source. And not only does it aid traceability, but it's also a call to action of sorts. Edit this page, right? And once we click on the provided link, we are taken to the React web page repository where we can make changes to the document. I think this is also a great way to encourage contributions, particularly to open source projects. So do try to enable this option if you work on one of them. However, not all projects are open source, and sometimes software cannot guide users to the source code. How to deal with this? Hopefully, you have a way to run your documentation builds locally, as I discussed before. Perhaps you could display links to source code only in local internal builds and then enable your internal contributors to quickly figure out where the documentation is coming from. Links to documentation sources will show us where the documentation comes from, but this doesn't mean that we're getting answers to all of the questions I have mentioned before. And this is where when using version control comes in. Version control for your documentation will give you information about authorship and reasons behind changes. Here's another example from memory repository. The commit history for the docs clearly shows who authored what and when. and that provides context for any maintenance fixes that we might need in the future. The fifth documentation maintenance pain point that we discovered was lack of guidelines. And I think this pain point probably resonates most with anyone who writes documentation only occasionally, or anyone who has never received targeted training on how to do this. These people might have questions such as what to put in the documentation or how to write it in general. And having these questions not answered can lead to a certain level of anxiety, and that in turn can lead to procrastination on doing those maintenance tasks. There are also other challenges related to guidelines, such as not knowing what the docstring standards are for the language or how to best use the documentation tooling that's available to us. And I think even seasoned documentarians might have questions like this, particularly when they start contributing to a new project, which is why I think everyone will benefit from making it standard. The first step to doing this is to promote standard language conventions. Some languages will codify their docstring standards in special documents. For instance, Python has PEP 257, Rust will have RFC 1574, and these documents contain information about how documentation should be structured, how to use any special tags, how to document function parameters and return values, and so on and so forth. Here's an example from the mentioned Rust RFC. And first of all, we can see an example on how to write an example. We can see that the triple slash signifies a comment start. We see an example's heading. We see how to mark code blocks. And the second part of this example shows you how to refer to types. We see that there are some general rules, but there are also some exceptions to these rules that you have to be aware of. Other languages do not have a single document, but a more general standard. For instance, tsdoc is the proposed standard for TypeScript comments. tsdoc specifies in a lot of detail how to use different tags, and here's an example on how to use the example tag. We see the example usage on how to add titles to the examples, and again, how to start and end code blocks. And the standard is similarly detailed for other tags it uses. There's a lot of advantage to using standards. First of all, they're an authoritative source that keeps everyone who uses the language on the same page. You don't have to specify them yourselves, and that, of course, saves you a lot of work. They're also maintained by experts in a language or steering committees. And these people usually take a lot of different use cases into account, so you can be sure that the standard is quite comprehensive. They also often come with automated tooling to check compliance, and that just ties back to my first point about automation. If you're using standards, you can get a lot of tooling almost for free. The next step is to codify any specific organizational standards that you might have. This works well if your docs have certain quirks that everyone in your company has to be aware of. Also, some languages don't have a single well-specified universally agreed on convention, so it might be useful to specify which particular one you wish to follow. Here's an example from Ruby on Rails API documentation guidelines. This document defines guidelines for a variety of things, as we can see in table of contents, from file names to how to use the Oxford comma in this particular documentation. But the guidelines document does not have to be very long. Here's an example from memory that's quite short. It specifies that both public and private elements need documentation. It links to the standard PEP 257 that I already mentioned. You also can notice that you don't have to specify your own standard for everything. A lot of companies and projects publicize their comprehensive style guides, and anyone can use these. And that can save you a lot of work, especially if your project has fairly standard usage of docstrings. Here we can see that memory uses Google-style docstrings. Next, suggesting content outlines for various types of document can alleviate some of that anxiety around not knowing what content to include in the documentation, particularly the long-form one like guides or tutorials. And these suggestions can help define how much detail the maintenance should include, or for instance, what tone to use. Here's another example from React contributing guidelines. And we can see that React tutorials should describe typical React workflows and are not really meant to discuss fine details of the framework. However, contributors are asked to meticulously describe every step of the tutorial so that the reader can easily follow and see the intended results. Guidelines can be general, like this one, or more specific, even down to providing a skeleton with the headings. And this can help not only with the maintenance, but also with new documentation, which is a win-win scenario for everyone. Finally, make sure that contributors are aware on how to use the documentation tools. If there are any aspects that might not be obvious or certain choices to be made, make sure to point it out. Here again, we're coming back to Ruby on Rails documentation guidelines, which clearly describe which tool to use and how to invoke it. And additionally, it looks like RDoc, the documentation generator, allows users to specify links in multiple ways. And Ruby on Rails maintainers prefer to use one of them for a specific reason, and that is clearly explained in the guidelines. Finally, the last documentation maintenance pain point is low task priority. Now, there is a saying in engineering that if you don't schedule time for maintenance, your system will schedule it for you. And that's certainly true to some degree about critical systems, but I'm not really sure if it translates very well to documentation. We all know that documentation can be very important to the success of a product or project, and that bad documentation quality can have detrimental effect on number of users or even on your revenue. But when documentation fails to deliver, it's rarely as spectacular as a server failure or a deployment that went wrong. Second of all, maintenance in general is sometimes underappreciated. We all know that maintenance is essential, but for a lot of people, it just doesn't have the same appeal as, for instance, delivering new feature or writing new documentation. And finally, it's often easier to start from a blank slate rather than to gather context for change in an existing document that maybe someone else wrote. All of these problems mean that documentation maintenance is sometimes not given the priority it maybe deserves. So what can we do to remedy this? My suggestion for this is to make it measurable. By demonstrating the impact that documentation can have, we can justify prioritizing it and investing resources into it. There are various metrics that we can use to demonstrate the impact, such as website analytics, user feedback, or number of client support tickets or questions on internal forums that could be resolved easier with better documentation. However, each documented product is different, so it's hard to make any blanket statements on which of these metrics are best for you, especially as it's easy to misinterpret numbers. However, I encourage you to check out these 2 talks from previous editions of Write the Docs conference that talk more about this particular aspect of documentation. First of all, don't trust the numbers, and second of all, measuring impact of your documentation. Finally, make it easier for your users to give feedback. This can help you gather some more data points and discover issues that your users might have. There's even some evidence from the open source community that providing an easy way to give feedback might increase the number of documentation contributions motivated by the users. So how to do this? Here's a simple example from React documentation page that lets users quickly express their sentiment about the page. And widgets like these can usually be connected to wider analytics systems that a lot of websites use. But if this is not something that you already have, it might be a big investment. So there are some simpler ways to do this. First of all, you could provide a static link to your issue tracker if you track issues, for instance, in your repository. And the good thing about most issues tracker is that they let you specify an issue template. So you can create one for documentation, think about what information you might need to fix the issue effectively, and quickly act on the feedback. If you gather information through support, you can also simply link to the support page at the bottom of your documentation page. And here we are. These are the 6 solutions I'm suggesting for 6 common documentation maintenance pain points. It's important to remember that these are not silver bullets, and they're not guaranteed to solve all of your problems. You have to consider how they fit into your specific project or product, as well as organization culture. For instance, even using the best version control system will not give you any of the context of your past changes if you do not have a habit of writing good commit messages. So finally, I would like to just reflect on the original motivation behind my talk on how we made some changes in response to all of that research. So I'm happy to say that as a result of some changes that we introduced in our internal documentation system, we have noticed a number of very good changes regarding documentation maintenance. First of all of the pull requests to the repositories documented in the new system include mandatory documentation preview checks. And that gives us an increased confidence for contributors on how their changes will impact documentation. The check shows them a preview of their documentation pages, and it also confirms that the changes that they made will not break the company-wide documentation build. Since introducing that new system, we have not yet experienced a documentation build failure caused by a code change, so it looks like it's working really well. Next, good feedback that we've got on the ability to create documentation preview locally is great. We can now see our documentation previews locally before even submitting a pull request, and we achieve that through an easy-to-use command line interface tool that makes it convenient to troubleshoot any problems. And that has led to less need to contact the maintainers of the documentation system for advice. Next, we have achieved better documentation quality after releasing documentation guidelines, which cover the expected docstring format for a code base, guidelines on the documentation structure, and some more general standards, and also instructions on how to get the most out of the tooling that we use. So now most of the questions that we receive are focused on situations which are not covered by the guidance and just serve as a motivation to continuously improve it. Finally, we have added an easier way to submit documentation feedback, and we are starting to see an increase in feedback points provided by the users. We hope that this trend continues and that it translates into an increased number of inner source contributions to our documentation. So I hope this talk inspired you to try out some of the solutions in your organizations and projects. If you would like to work on similar projects with us, please feel free to check out our careers website. Thank you so much for listening, and please feel free to contact me by email about anything in this presentation, and I'm also looking forward to receiving your questions during the conference Q&A.
So Emilia and Carissa, welcome, and thank you both for submitting such interesting talks to Write the Docs. I love it that we're in this documentation community and that we can have these really in-depth, almost nerdy docs conversations. So Emilia, I'm going to start with you. My first question for you is, how do you make it easier for other people that don't maintain documentation to actually contribute to this, if you have this docs as code approach?
So I think one of the key points here is traceability that I talked about. Many people, when I ask them, why do you not contribute to documentation? Why do you not correct the bugs themselves? They say, well, I don't really know where that documentation lives, which is a very valid concern. So I think traceability really helps with this, showing people where exactly to edit. But even when giving feedback, you just have to make it very easy. We went from having like a small notice in the footer to like a really big, obvious feedback button at the top. And that really helped. But another aspect that I haven't really talked about is that you have to make sure that when people contribute or give you feedback, you respond to it in a timely manner, because people tend to remember when things get moving fast and not. So I think this really helps to create this like really nice atmosphere about contributing to docs, give people good experience, and hopefully get them to contribute even more.
Yeah, that's true. I guess it works that way with a lot of different feedback fields as well. If people feel like they're actually seeing the difference that their contribution makes, it makes it more likely for them to contribute in the future.
Definitely.
That's true. So Carissa, I guess it maybe kind of leads into a question I had around your talk. You mentioned at some point that low-hanging fruits are a really good place to start focusing. But how do you find these low-hanging fruits in your documentation?
Yeah, so I saw that too, and I was like, oh, that's a really good question. Basically, it depends on what your goals are on your team. So for example, like if you're a team of one, so when I started, it was just me, I would go through and it's almost like you have a list going of all the things that you want to make improvements on. I know for me, some of my low-hanging fruit was that the articles for our, like a specific tool, were just super out of date, and like this, there were just no screenshots. And so it depends on, again, what your tool is and what you're writing for, but sometimes screenshots are really helpful to kind of explain really technical bits. So like I knew, I was like, okay, I have this doc, and this doc that all I need to do is just go in, take screenshots and add them. So that would be like my first low-hanging fruit. So you'll start realizing as you're going through the documentation of like, oh, this is a really easy job, or oh, this is going to take me days, hour, however long. And it very much depends on what you have to do in all of your documentation to say, okay, this is my low-hanging fruit. So like what my low-hanging fruit of taking screenshots could be a lot of work for somebody if they have 500 docs that they have to do that to, right? Whereas maybe for somebody else, it could just be like spell checking a single section, just really and based on the time you have as well, and just making sure that you're not overwhelming yourself and not identifying things as like, oh yeah, I'm just going to redo this entire doc section of 50 docs in a week. And that's my low-hanging fruit. It's like, no, really do baby steps and say, okay, this task will take me an hour, and I know that I will get return on this because of X, Y, and Z. And then you can say, okay, this is my list of little baby things that I can do in order to make improvements.
And I guess it's also nice to have this list because it kind of gets you to start building momentum on maintaining your docs, which Emilia is also the subject of your talk. And I guess that's something else that I was wondering about maintenance. Emilia, you mentioned a lot of good tips, and people were very impressed with the amount of resources that you shared in your talk. But I was wondering, like, what's maybe the one thing if people go home after Write the Docs? What's the one place you tell them to start looking add this or do this one thing if you want to improve the maintenance of your documentation?
I think it would be making it the part of your process of releasing new software. I think it all starts with awareness. If people are not aware that documentation is important and that it needs to be maintained, it doesn't matter how many standards checkers you input or how many checks you add in your CI or like how many metrics you attach to them, people will just not be aware of it. So even doing the small actions, just adding things to your pull request templates that ask you, hey, have you updated the documentation? Have you thought about it? Can like spark a discussion maybe around the PR, or can like flip a switch in people's head to say, you know, this is important. You should be looking at it. So I think it all starts with awareness. So I would say making it part of your entire life cycle of software is the key. And this is where you can build upon adding like all the different things like automation, metrics, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think it feeds nicely into the answer you previously mentioned about making the feedback button visible. If you don't even make it visible that you can make changes to the documentation or do the maintenance, it makes it a lot more difficult.
Exactly. I just feel like if you build this culture of, you know, documentation is important, it's not just an afterthought. It's also easy to convince people to invest in maintenance because they see how much return you can get and how big of a burden it can be on documentarians, and trying to help them out can really make the world better for everyone.
Yeah. You mentioned something about for people seeing the value. Carissa, in your talk, I think this whole concept around a self-service score generated a lot of discussion in the chat. Maybe can you tell us a bit more about how do you actually measure the self-service score, or is there some tips or techniques that you can share with us how you can work with it?
Yeah, and one of the things I saw a couple of people talking about self-service score as well, and like how it might not apply for everybody depending on if you have a support team or if you're doing something outside of just like straight up technical documentation or written documentation. But my favorite thing about self-service score, and again, if we're talking about self-service score like the Zendesk, like trademarked self-service score, right? It's very specific to what it does. But I like to kind of take a little like creative liberty of it, right? So for sure, it's like you do your self-service score, and we do the Zendesk one as well for our documentation. And for that, it's just we're monitoring the sessions of people coming in, and then just seeing who's going to the contact form and clicking submit at the end of their session. And that's how we get those metrics. But the really cool thing that I just like about metrics in general, and specifically self-service score, is that you can really mold it to what it is for you, right? So for us, we also started moving into more customer education, like e-learning content. So we have some courses as well. But like our self-service score, right, is we're able to kind of see, okay, who visits our courses and who sits there, you know, who takes the course, and then are they within the next 10, 15 days reaching out to our support team or submitting some type of email to maybe our team specifically, right? So we can see, you can kind of like change it up a bit and make it moldable to you. So for example, if you're just doing videos, you know, you could see your video views and you can see the sessions of people watching those views and then monitor it to see if anybody is reaching out. And if you don't have a support team, that's where it kind of gets a little confusing a bit, because you're just like, okay, well, you know, nobody's specifically reaching out to my team, so I don't know if they're self-serving. But again, it's that creative piece where you can look at average time. You can see how long people are on your page compared to when they're not interacting with your content. Even like if your company has like a Twitter account, you know, like are people like reaching out on Twitter? You know, like what are they doing after they interact with your content? And if they're actually going to the session, getting something out of it, whether it's reading, interacting, watching, and having a successful user journey and understanding what you're writing or what content you're presenting them.
Yeah, it sounds like at least having a really robust Google Analytics type of thing implemented on your documentation helps a lot with.
It does. And like we're at the point where we do, which is great. But like even in the beginning, and I said this as well in the talk, like if you just add Google Analytics and just leave it, you don't have to do anything to it. All of those basic stats that comes with it automatically, where you're not setting up anything custom, is insanely beneficial, because I know I always go back to this because I was a lone writer for a really long time, and I swear by it. Like the fact that it really helps kind of moving the conversation forward with stakeholders as well, because they're going to be asking those questions, and even if you don't do anything with your Google Analytics, if that one stakeholder comes to you and says, hey, I don't know, I need to know about X, Y, and Z in order to maybe give you more time of day, or increase your resources. If you just give yourself a couple hours in Google Analytics, when they ask you those questions, you're more than likely you're going to be able to pull something out just having the basics running constantly. So yes, it is helpful to have a intense setup, and if you have a team that can do that, it's amazing. But if you just have it going, you can get the metrics that you need in order to make the statement that has backup.
Yeah, that's true. I was thinking about how you would gather metrics. I think what you've mentioned was a lot on how people consume documentation. Emilia, I'm not sure if you have any idea, is there a good way where you can add metrics if you have docs as code? Is that setup process also kind of set up that you can get metrics from it easily?
I'm not really sure about this. If your documentation gets generated as a web page later on, you can definitely hook things up. If people are just accessing it through code itself, or maybe doc strings in their IDE, that's a little bit harder to measure. So I'm afraid I don't really have a good answer for it. But even if you don't have any very specific numeric metrics, it's still worth tapping into maybe your network at a company, if they're internal docs, or talking to your clients, because they will be able to give you, if not robust quantitative feedback, you can still get a lot of information about how they use their documentation, whether it's good for them or not. This is how we gathered a lot of feedback in preparation for our documentation system migration. We set up a working group. So even if we did not have numbers, we still had information about what's missing, what people are looking to improve. And that was a very valuable source. But unfortunately, I don't have a lot of experience with measuring metrics for docs as code. So I'm sorry about that.
Yeah. But I mean, like I said, I think it's a pretty interesting area. And I think if you've given us some valuable comments about talking to your stakeholders and things like that are also very important data points.
And people do generally want to talk about this kind of stuff if you pull their tongue enough. So definitely you should try to talk to people about your documentation, people that you may know, maybe from even different situations.
Yeah. All right. Well, Emilia and Carissa, thank you very much for sharing your insights into documentation and answering our questions. And if I'm not mistaken, then we have a coffee break right now. And yeah, well, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much.